Thanks for listening to the Archbridge podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wilterdink, and today I'm joined by Chris Edwards. Chris is the Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, editor of downsizinggovernment.org, and an expert on federal, state, and tax budget issues. Before joining Cato, Chris was a senior economist at the Congressional Joint Economic Committee, a manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and an economist with the Tax Foundation. Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me, Ben. Absolutely.
So I did want to dive right into the most recent report that you put out, which is called Entrepreneurs and Regulations. And it focuses a lot on something that we've talked a lot about at the Archbridge Institute and something that I really care about, which is removing state and local barriers to new businesses. So I wanted to kind of kick it off by getting a little bit more background about the landscape of small businesses and sort of think about what are we dealing with here? How big is the economic footprint of small businesses when you look at businesses in general? What are some of the ways in which that's changed in maybe some of the past couple of decades? So can you give us a sense of what that landscape looks like?
Sure. Well, startup businesses are, of course, extremely important for growth in the economy. I mean, all the major corporations today in America, whether it's Apple or Amazon, they all started out as single-person outfits, often in homes and garages. And so we want to encourage the founding of small businesses, and we want to pave the way for their strong growth so that they can become major players. So there's been a lot of concern in the economics profession that the rate of startup businesses in America has been falling since the late 1970s. In other words, the percent of all businesses that are new businesses founded less than a year ago or less than 5 years ago has been declining in America, and there's been a lot of concern about that. And there's various explanations. Maybe younger people are less interested in starting businesses. Maybe younger people have a lot of student debt to deal with. Another possible reason is that the increasing amounts of regulation in America is creating a larger barrier to entrepreneurs, especially young entrepreneurs, from starting businesses. So that's what I tackle in this new study out at the Cato Institute, and I particularly focus on state and local government regulation. The federal government, is a whole different kettle of fish. It imposes a lot of damaging regulations as well, but I'm focusing here on state and local regulations, everything from zoning to occupational licensing laws and many other sorts of impositions that state and local governments impose that create a barrier to startups.
Yeah, that's good to know. I think it's really, really important to look at that. I mean, one thing I wanted to ask you a little bit about is some of your colleagues in economics. The person probably most prominently that I can think of about this is Tyler Cowen. He not recently now, I guess it's a couple years old. He wrote a book that was in defense of big business, and some of the other folks like maybe Matt Iglesias comes to mind. Some people think that big business gets a little bit of a bad rap in the sense that they typically are known for providing better benefits to their employees, or they spend more money on research and development. So you've kind of sung some of the praises of smaller businesses that are market leaders or kind of leading towards innovation. Can you talk a little bit about the balance between how much we should be concerned about bigger businesses versus smaller businesses, or how do you see that?
Sure. Well, of course, I am for free markets. I am for the government creating a neutral and limited landscape so that, all businesses and entrepreneurs can prosper. To give you an example of, so there's an ecosystem here. Small businesses and large businesses work together as well as compete against each other. And so, for example, we've seen over the last year in fighting the pandemic that both hundreds of small biotech companies in America as well as the big pharma companies, they both have played a very important role in tackling the pandemic. These new vaccines developed by Moderna in Massachusetts, that's a small biotech company. That was crucially important, but then also, big pharma companies like Pfizer have been extremely important as well in distributing and manufacturing the vaccines. So, there is a place for both big and small businesses in America. I think a lot of economists have focused on the fact that, there are two types of small businesses. There's sort of mom and pop small businesses. There's about 10 or 15 million of those in America. They're very important for neighborhoods and cities, but they don't. The entrepreneurs don't necessarily want to grow them large. We're talking neighborhood restaurants and the like. Those are important for neighborhoods and the like. But then there's another group of small businesses, often called gazelles, that start out small and then grow big. And we see this in the tech industry all the time. I mean, Apple Computer started off, as a small two-man shop with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in the late 70s. They, of course, became a colossus and really pushed technology ahead in America. So that latter type of business is extremely important, and we want to make sure that there's enough growth capital for those companies to grow, and they're extremely important for job creation. I mean, small businesses create most net new jobs in America, and a lot of that is these rapidly growing businesses that start out small and rapidly grow into large, behemoths in the economy. I mean, Amazon, for example, started as a small business in Jeff Bezos' garage in Seattle back in 1994. Today it employs more than 1 million people. So, that type of company is extremely important for the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I recently read that Amazon was the second largest private employer just after Walmart, if I'm not mistaken, which was
right.
Which is pretty amazing, to think, when they started and where they are now, of course. Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I like the term gazelles. I've also heard unicorns,
Yeah, unicorns are, I think, they're companies that hit $1 billion in valuation, and so it's the same kind of idea. These rapidly growing companies. And it's not just that they create jobs; it's also that these sorts of companies are often crucial for innovation. And people. There's been a lot of concern in recent years by both politicians on the left and the right about how some industries seem to be rigged and the big companies have too much power. Well, the way to deal with that is to make sure we eliminate entry barriers for startup companies to challenge existing sort of stagnant industries, sort of like the way Uber challenged the taxi cab monopolies, or the way Airbnb challenged the big hotel companies. We want to encourage that sort of entry into industries so that the small guys can challenge the big guys to the benefit of consumers.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can still remember, I lived in D.C. for several years, and I remember the first time a friend of mine was getting something called an Uber, and I was like, wait, how much is this going to cost? At the time they didn't have Uber X yet. It was just the black car service, and it's crazy to think how ubiquitous that's become. And I take it to and from the airport every time I go, or if I'm in a new city. I don't really travel any other way, and that wasn't even a thing, just like 10 years ago or something like that. So it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and that sort of, so we're getting that sort of tech-driven innovation, not just in those two industries, but in financial services. There's all these so-called fintech companies that are coming in. They're cutting the profit margins of the big Wall Street banks and financial services companies, which is great for consumers. Mm-hmm. You're getting it in healthcare. A lot of new tech-driven, data-driven companies are coming in, trying to cut the cost of healthcare. You're seeing it in all these, new areas like electric vehicles, and this is great. I mean, the American economy is dynamic. We want to remove barriers to let these newcomers come in, challenge existing companies, push innovation ahead. It's the most important thing for the economy in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. So you touched on something I want to kind of dig into a little bit more, which is something that I know a lot of people are really concerned about. I'm concerned about it. A lot of people I work with on economic mobility issues are concerned about it. But there does seem to have been, at least since the 1970s or maybe even the early 80s, that steep drop off in business dynamism. The rate of new businesses forming versus older businesses shutting down has been I don't want to say a nosedive, but it's declined significantly. And so you outlined a couple of possible causes for that. Do you think that is mostly from, proliferation on the state and local level? We have some of these regulations that we'll dig into for sure. But, you also had things like Dodd-Frank, which really upended the financial services industry. It made it so that some of these more regional startups couldn't access the capital that they needed to grow because their local bank or their regional bank was consolidated, because, at least the story that I've seen has been they couldn't compete with the new regulations under the Dodd-Frank financial stuff. And so they all kind of lumped into these large, funds that are really reluctant to give out more small or more regional or even more long-term loans. So how do you sort of think about what caused that? And is this something that can be unwound at the local and state level, or is this really going to take a federal rethink to kind of get that back up? How do you think about that?
So, yeah, I would divide this into two different sort of areas of concern about regulation. One is product market regulation, and so that's what I go into in this new Cato study. I look at the fact that a lot of state and local governments, they'll restrict certain industries, like, say, the marijuana industry now, even though it's been legalized in a lot of states, there's all kinds of restrictions on that prevent entrepreneurs from expanding and growing. So that's sort of product market regulation. But then on the other side, as you say, there's lots of regulations on the flow of capital to small businesses. Small businesses, startups get money from debt markets or equity markets. You touched on there's financial services regulation, bank regulation often stymies the flow of loans to startup and growing small businesses. But then there's whole other areas of regulation that I'm looking at in a new upcoming Cato study, taxes and regulations on the flow of venture capital and angel investment to fast-growing startup businesses, often tech businesses. So I think that's the way you want to think about it. Does the government limit the types of the industries and the products and the services that businesses provide, and does the government, through regulation, limit the flow of debt and equity capital to small and growing businesses? Yeah,
that's really interesting because it does sound like there is that two sides of that coin, where sometimes they'll just outright ban something from being, open to entrepreneurial activity, like you were saying in some marijuana businesses. Out here where I am, I'm actually based in Alaska. We've had, recreational marijuana for, I think, 4 or 5 years now. And it's still, there's a lot of regulations around it, much more so than some of the other ones. But, I was surprised to learn even our alcohol industry is so regulated. And like you get into some of that too, where, for instance, we have a lot of different breweries up here in Alaska, a lot of small breweries. It's amazing for a consumer like me who loves that stuff. But the breweries are only allowed to stay open till 8 p.m. They can't have any sort of live music, or even it's not even allowed for them to have a TV in the place of business, because that's creating an entertainment atmosphere or something like that. So there are a lot of those kinds of tricky regulations, and I know that those are at the state and local level. It's not like those are federally mandated. So there's, even in a place like Alaska where people might think, oh, well, it's kind of out there, it's a little more free. Well, in some ways. So
that's right. So to drill in on that industry, the alcohol industry is a good one to indicate how regulations restrict entrepreneurship in America, and unnecessarily so. We have all these regulations that were piled on during the Prohibition era at the state local level that we still haven't repealed, even though they don't make any sense today. So for example, all the states have these quasi-monopoly distribution agencies. If you're a small brewer and you want to get your product to market, you generally have to go through one of these quasi-monopolies. But however, there are most of the states allow for some self-distribution of alcohol, which has allowed craft breweries to grow. But there are limits on that, and there's really no reason for these monopolies that states have put in place that favor the big breweries over the small, growing entrepreneurial breweries. That's the type of regulation that really makes no sense for consumers. It's antiquated, and we ought to repeal. Interestingly, that whole industry, the craft beer industry, I'm a big fan. That was only possible because of deregulation. Sometimes people will criticize deregulation as being sort of reckless or something like that. But, before 1978, it was illegal to brew beer in your home, even for your own consumption. Remarkable. People have forgotten that. It was actually Jimmy Carter signed into law the deregulation federally of home brewing, and that led entrepreneurs to go into home brewing, and then states had all their own rules restricted founding breweries and selling to consumers. States started to deregulate, and that's why we saw during the 80s and 90s this explosion in craft breweries, in brew pubs, and that sort of stuff. That entire industry now, that tens of millions of Americans enjoy, is only possible because of federal and state deregulation. So that's the way we should think about regulation. Where can we deregulate to open up space for entrepreneurs to jump in and add to GDP and add to the economy and create jobs?
Yeah, absolutely. I had no idea that the brewing in your home would be illegal. I mean, that feels offensive to me.
It's remarkable.
That somebody would think that that's okay.
But of course, until recently, the same was true with marijuana.
Yeah.
There's now 18 states have legalized marijuana, have legalized recreational marijuana. But actually, that doesn't mean there's still all these rules and regulations imposed on marijuana. The thing is, when marijuana was illegal, yes, we had entrepreneurship in marijuana, but it's just a lot more difficult when the product is illegal. You legalize and normalize the industry, the financing becomes easier for entrepreneurs, and everything about operating their business becomes easier. It becomes more efficient and safer. The problem is that even in a lot of those 18 states that have legalized marijuana, California is a good example, they impose all these regulation that makes it difficult for entrepreneurs. So in California, recreational marijuana is legal, but only 1/3 of the counties in California allow the creation of marijuana businesses, growing, retailing, manufacturing, that sort of thing. And then even the municipalities, the counties that that allow marijuana businesses, they strictly cap the number of businesses. So, a town will say, okay, we will allow, 6 marijuana businesses in our town. The problem with that is it creates this huge lobbying demand to get these limited number of licenses. A lot of entrepreneurs who want to enter this industry are stymied now. It makes absolutely no sense. It seems to me, the products like this that everyone is using anyway should be legalized and normalized and have open entry so that entrepreneurs can come in and in an organized and safe way can add to the economy, add to GDP.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in total agreement with that. I mean, I know some of the marijuana businesses around here, I mean, because it's still technically not federally legal, they have issues. Obviously, they have issues accessing capital. None of the big banks that are interstate operable want to touch them. And if I were a bank executive, I don't know if I'd want to take that risk either. Because of that, or partly because of that, they have trouble. They're still a cash business. You have these businesses that have huge revenues, and they're paying a lot of taxes, and they're having to drop off cash, and it's just it's insane. I mean, it's 2021. It seems insane.
There's an interesting parallel between marijuana and alcohol in this way, too, that all 3 levels of government regulate both industries. So if you want to open a craft brewery, you need licensing approval from local, state, and the federal government. And in fact, multiple federal agencies regulate you as a craft brewery. Now it's unfortunately the same with marijuana. You mentioned there's a bunch of federal regulations that still stand in the way of marijuana businesses that have been legalized at the state level, and one of them you mentioned is these restrictions that make it difficult for businesses to normalize their financing and have regular banking relationships. So we need the federal. I mean, one step would be we need the federal government to get out of these industries completely. And then we need state and local governments themselves to deregulate more.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to kind of maybe broaden it out a bit. One of the terms that jumped out at me as I was going through your report that I think everyone should know about, but very few people really know about, and I want you to explain, is the term mandated costs. So that's something that you describe in the report. when you're thinking about new business entrepreneur and new entrepreneurs coming into it, they have to deal with these mandated costs. So can you explain what those are and sort of how that works and how we might think about mandated costs?
So, of course, startup businesses and small businesses, they need to deal with taxes, but a parallel to tax, businesses, entrepreneurs, when they launch businesses, they find out that the government mandates that they provide these certain benefits and have all these rules and restrictions on the way their business operates, which imposes costs on them. One of the most important examples is minimum wages. The federal government imposes a minimum wage, but then dozens of states impose minimum wages even higher than the federal minimum wage now. So minimum wages are a particular disadvantage to small businesses because, small businesses, if you look at the overall statistics, on average pay much lower wages and overall compensation than big businesses. And there's various reasons for that. But one way to think about this is that small businesses are at a competitive disadvantage to big businesses for all kinds of reasons. They can't have, big dedicated marketing departments or legal departments and that sort of stuff. And so paying lower wages and providing a much more sort of family-friendly work atmosphere is one way they can compete against the big corporations. The problem when the government imposes minimum wages, they eliminate this advantage that small businesses have, makes it harder for them to compete against big businesses, and it's very unfair. And so, the obvious example here is restaurant businesses. Small independent restaurants compete against the big corporate chains in every city, and raising minimum wages puts those independent restaurants at a bigger disadvantage compared to the big corporate chains. So that is one good example, but then state governments have imposing more sort of mandated costs on businesses all the time. I think there's about 8 states now, for example, that impose mandated paid leave for workers, which imposes a new payroll cost on businesses and makes it harder for businesses to hire workers. So this is a whole area of government regulation that's detrimental to small businesses, particularly compared to larger businesses.
Yeah, and thinking about that, plus, when you take away the advantage that you're talking about that small businesses have when they can kind of compete on the wage front, big businesses, they have money. They can invest in automation. They can invest in different types of capital that can sort of, make the minimum wage irrelevant to them, in a way that smaller businesses can't. Obviously, they don't have that kind of access to capital, or they might not have, the kind of reserves that would allow them to invest in that same way. So that's really too bad.
There is a broader, the broader policy environment here, and this is something economists have pointed out for decades, that often regulations work to the favor of big business and against small businesses and new entry to industry. And oftentimes, big businesses that dominate an industry will favor government imposing greater regulation because they know the regulation works against the small businesses more than it works against them. I mean, one reason why that is, there's sort of an economies of scale in dealing with regulations. So big businesses can have special legal departments that understand the intricacies of all the legal rules, and they can deal more effectively and cheaply with all the regulations. For small entrepreneurs starting into an industry that's heavily regulated, it's very difficult for the entrepreneur to deal with all the regulations while dealing with all the the market challenges that entrepreneur faces. So regulations, one way to think about them is they tend to work in favor of the big businesses and against the small businesses.
Yeah, I think we see that across industries. Sometimes I wonder to what extent that dynamic plays into sort of both on the populist right and on the populist left. You sort of have this sense of, it's the elites against the rest of us, it's them against us, it's all rigged, like all this kind of stuff. And then that kind of feeds, it goes in different directions on the left and the right. On the left, they want to impose a lot more regulations to try to figure all this out, in a kind of technocratic way, or maybe boosting unions. On the right, it turns out that they, want to restrict trade. They're trying to eliminate competitors, in that way, and they want to restrict immigration. But I wonder how much of that is really just a function of these bigger, incumbent market players sort of working the system in this more granular way that really does make it seem like the little guy is at such a disadvantage.
Yeah, I think that, sometimes the instinct of the politicians on both left and the right, they sort of do sense maybe that some say with the tech companies that the big tech companies do have certain advantages, and we were talking about regulation, but then their impulse to try to fix the problem is usually wrong. The solution to oligopolies in industries is nearly always open entry. Policymakers should look at industries. They should try to understand what the regulatory barriers to open entry are in the industry, and provide for open entry. And this is actually the topic of a new Cato study I'll have coming out, particularly focusing on angel investors and venture capital. These sources of capital fund startup businesses who want to who enter industries and challenge, the big oligopolies and business cartels. You see, of course, in the high tech industry all the time. Yeah, a lot of high-tech businesses will get large, but the way to deal with that is to provide for open entry, to make sure that there's a large amount of capital in Silicon Valley and other tech regions going to the new startup businesses that will challenge the existing dominant players. So the policymakers sometimes sense that there's something wrong with industries, and maybe they're right, but the way to deal with it is open entry and competitive challenges in the marketplace. One of the government responses is often antitrust rules, more vigorous antitrust rules to try to force competition. The history, the record of government antitrust over the last century is really terrible. They often make giant mistakes. Antitrust, it's an attempt to centrally plan industries. It usually does not work. Historically, we have many examples of this. I mean, the government went after IBM during the 70s for over a decade. They hammered IBM on antitrust. But in the end, what slayed the IBM quasi-monopoly in the computer industry was the new startup businesses, the Apple computer and all the new startups in the late 70s and early 80s. Interestingly, you go back a decade from that, around 1970 or so, the federal government went after Xerox for monopolizing the photocopy industry. But it wasn't the government antitrust enforcement that broke open that industry. It was new competition from Japan. All these new lower cost, better photocopy machines started coming in from Japan and really put Xerox back on its heels. So, open competition, open entry, that's the way to deal with dominant players in the tech industry and other industries.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm reminded of, I think maybe it was either Fortune or Forbes or something. Occasionally you'll see it floating around on social media. There's like that famous front cover, this guy has a cell phone and it's like, Nokia, can anyone catch the cell phone king? And it's just like, come on. Well, in the report, speaking of policymakers allowing for open entry, you develop, or you introduce the Entrepreneur Regulatory Barriers Index. So can you explain what that is and sort of what kind of went into that as you were putting that together?
So when I started researching these state and local policy areas that I think are regulatory barriers to businesses, I put together a list of about 17 different types of regulation where we have some pretty decent state comparison figures. So to run through a few, I look at occupational licensing levels by state, minimum wages, certificate of need laws. These are laws that limit entry into the healthcare industry. Local government business permitting, alcohol licensing, marijuana licensing. We looked at those issues. Home-based business restrictions, which we can get into. So I took 17 measures of how easy it is for entrepreneurs to start businesses across the states, and I ranked the states And I sort of found some of the states that are the best for entrepreneurs in terms of state and local regulation, that have the minimum regulation, and then the states that are worse for entrepreneurs. So the 5 best states, I think, that have the most modest regulatory barriers for entrepreneurs are Georgia, South Dakota, North Dakota, Colorado, and New Hampshire. The worst states probably won't be a surprise to some of the listeners today: Connecticut, New Jersey, California, Hawaii, and Washington State. New York was right near the top as well. Those states have the largest barriers to entrepreneurs and startup businesses. So a lot of these barriers don't make much sense, as we were discussing alcohol and marijuana barriers. And my recommendation for policymakers in every state is to look at the other states that have less regulation on specific industries and types of regulation, and ask whether the more regulation in their state is providing better outcomes, or whether they can deregulate and go the direction that some of the freer states have. I mean, so for example, certificate of need laws are these laws that impose bureaucratic rules in the way of businesses entering the healthcare industry. There's 34 states that have these laws. The laws are really dumb. The original idea of the laws was, we're going to have bureaucratic panels limit entry into the healthcare industry to try to lower costs. Well, to any economist, that makes no sense, because more supply in an industry reduces cost. So these laws make no sense. We've had many government commissions over the decades say that these laws don't make sense, and 16 states have, to their credit, have repealed these laws. So that's good. So I would urge the other 34 states that have certificate of need laws to say, hey, the healthcare industry works, just fine in these 16 states that don't have these laws. We should go in that direction. And so that's I think my main recommendation here is that states should look at the states that are that have deregulated in all these areas and ask whether the deregulation has how it has worked out, and to move in that direction if it seems like it offers superior results.
That's the kind of smart policy making that I wish we're a little more common out there. When I was reviewing the list of those states, I wasn't exactly surprised at the top 5 and the bottom 5. I was deeply disappointed that my own Alaska was smack in the middle at 25, and so we'll have to work on that and get some of that, boost that up a little bit. But one note of optimism as I look across some of the states, state policy is something I've worked on for a few years now, maybe more than I'd like to admit. I'm seeing some progress. Like you mentioned, it was 16 states that repealed their certificate of need laws. I know other states are considering that. There had been a couple of states, I think Virginia was one of the leaders here, where they come up with these red tape commissions, which is loosely based on, I think, an idea from British Columbia, where they actually measure the number of regulations, and then they set a goal for, if they're going to introduce a new one, they have to sunset at least 2 until they reach a certain floor. And that seems to be going at least fairly well in some states. Lots of states, most notably Arizona, I think was the one that kind of led on this. They've been either deregulating occupational licenses through rolling reviews of the different licenses they have, or they've just been passing things like universal recognition, which allows people to move into the state. And as long as they have a license in good standing from where they previously lived, they can apply for the new one and get all of the requirements for education and fees and stuff are generally waived. So I see a lot of movement on this stuff in the states, or at least that's how it looks to me. Am I being a little too optimistic, or what do you think about that?
Sure. I think, occupational licensing is a very interesting area, and you're right. I think there is some forward progress there towards freeing up the economy. As you know, Ben, it's pretty dramatic when you look at the history of occupational licensing. If you go back to the 1950s, only 5% of occupations in America had required occupational licensing, which are, in other words, government regulatory barriers to people entering professions. So only 5% back in the 1950s. But today, about 22% of all occupations in the United States require government occupational licensing. No one disagrees that, occupational licenses for, say, doctors and dentists, make some sense. But the market alternative is certification, the voluntary certification that a lot of states, for example, they have occupational licensing for occupations like florists or auctioneers. And barbers and these sorts of things. That doesn't make much sense. An alternative is certification allowing entrepreneurs to enter industries, but in order to have a designation showing their expertise, they can get different levels of private certification. Some industries like auto mechanics, I understand, use certification more than licensing, and so that makes a lot more sense to me. So there is a movement in the right direction. I mean, Arizona's made some reforms, as you mentioned. Florida's made some reforms. So in the occupational licensing area, I would encourage states to go through the lists of dozens of occupations that require licenses, to repeal the requirements in a lot of areas, and to examine, what other states have done, and again, learn lessons from the least regulated states in those areas.
I hope so. I definitely see some momentum building on that, which is good news, but it's definitely an uphill battle. I think, I wonder, with the occupational licensing stuff in particular, what the dynamic that I see is, we have this phenomenon that, again, we see concentrated benefits, diffuse costs, this cost of having the license. They raise prices for consumers. They restrict entry into the market. But having that barrier is really good for the incumbent players, right? The people who are already there, the businesses that are already there, they have this huge stake in, keeping that sort of benefit, that little perk they have. And so every time something like this comes up for review or it's discussed, they all swarm the decision makers, and there's really, there's no weaker constituency than, would have been entrepreneurs. So
I think that's right. And I think, Ben, that's why governor leadership is so important. A lot of these industries get heavily regulated by these special interests in sort of this corrupt manner because it flies below the radar, and most of the public is not really aware of it. I mean, the states, for example, that require occupational licensing for interior designers, probably most of the residents of those states probably have no idea that the government does this and would think it's dumb if they heard about it. But unless it rises to the level of a governor, raising the issue in the State of the State speeches and that sort of thing, and putting it on the agenda as Governor Ducey did in Arizona, a lot of people may not know about these sort of silly laws and regulations that their state has. So, leadership by governors is very important in a lot of these areas of regulation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit. We've been talking about some of the federal restrictions and regulations, particularly on the financial side, which we'll probably have to have you back for that report on the venture capital stuff. That's a really fascinating area that I'm really interested in. But we're coming out of a pandemic. You would think that policymakers would do everything they can to kind of make this. Remember, we all heard about the V-shaped recovery, and by some metrics, we're doing pretty well, but could be better in certain ways. So one thing that your report hits on a lot that's kind of really, really important to me is home-based businesses, right? We've all been spending a lot more time at home. I'm at home right now. I work from home, consistently. So how difficult is it to start a home-based business? How many home-based businesses are out there? And what level of government is usually preventing more home-based businesses from being formed?
So home-based businesses are a crucial part of the American economy that is often overlooked. The Small Business Administration estimates that about half of U.S. businesses are home-based. And of course, with the internet and all
wow, half?
About half. It's remarkable. Of course, with the internet and the new technologies these days, it's easier and easier for people to run a business out of the home. And about 2/3 of all startups in America started up as home-based businesses. As I mentioned, Jeff Bezos started Amazon in his garage in 1994. Steve Jobs started Apple in his garage way back in the late 70s. Hewlett Packard started in a garage back in Silicon Valley. Home-based businesses are crucial because they create businesses that help neighborhoods thrive, but also they're really important as sort of incubators for future big businesses in America. The problem is that in the mid-20th century, governments went way overboard with local zoning rules that tried to strictly regulate businesses out of residential neighborhoods. There was this idea called Euclidean zoning that in cities must strictly separate commercial, industrial, residential uses for property. Well, I mean, that's for one thing that's anti-freedom, but another thing, it's stifled home-based businesses. There's been a bit of a movement backwards now in a deregulatory direction. We've seen this, for example, in home daycares. If you wind the clock back a few decades, home daycares were generally illegal everywhere. It makes absolutely no sense, especially with today's modern, couples, often with both husband and wife working. So there's been some deregulation on that front. There's this big area called cottage food. A lot of people like to cook and bake in their home and sell their products in local markets, farmer markets, and that sort of stuff. The rules on that are slowly and steadily being deregulated. Wyoming, for example, now allows people to make anything in their home for sale and retail markets other than meat-based products. They require, have special safety issues. So these are all good movements. Nonetheless, there's still a lot of regulation in the way of home-based businesses here. And you think about it, there's dozens and dozens of businesses these days that people can run out of their homes. I'm going to do a shout out here to the Institute of Justice, a libertarian think tank in D.C. that has done a fabulous job going around the country and litigating to try to get some of these overly restrictive rules repealed. So to give you an example, in Nashville, they took up the case of a fellow who's a well-known music producer. He had a music production studio in his home in a residential neighborhood, so he would get visitors, maybe one or two a day, to his home-based studio, musicians doing recording. Well, this was illegal under Nashville city zoning rules, and there's been Institute for Justice litigated that battle. They also litigated another one in Nashville where an individual wanted to run a single chair salon out of in her basement that she built. So this was also illegal. So luckily, Nashville, based partly on the Institute for Justice's litigation, has made some reforms. They've allowed home-based businesses. The key is here that there is the issue of externalities. No one wants a big, noisy, loud, smelly manufacturing business right next to them in their suburban neighborhood. But that's often not the issue. Often cities go overboard and they ban businesses outright in all kinds of ways. Even aside, even businesses that are producing no externalities for their neighbors, and that just doesn't make sense. There is a balance here. Yes, we all, a lot of us want to live in quiet suburban neighborhoods, but also, this is America. We have property rights. People own their property. You should generally be able to use your property as you see fit, as long as you're not imposing undue externalities or negative nuisances on your neighbors. So I'm in favor of liberalization of local zoning laws to allow more entrepreneurs to start businesses. Again, businesses are a low-cost incubator. A lot of young entrepreneurs in particular, they can't afford to go and rent. They have an idea for a business. They can't afford to go rent commercial space right away. They need to incubate a business in their home as a low-cost way to see whether their business idea works. That's one of the reasons why home-based businesses are so important.
Yeah, and actually, this one hits a little close to home. So, a quick story: when we were living in California, maybe 2 years ago at this point, my wife started a cookie business out of our apartment. And so she makes great cookies. She mails them to all of our relatives on Christmas time and things like that. And she was not working at the time. We thought, okay, let's why not? There's a few bars around here. Maybe they'd like to sell them or whatever. No intention of really getting it big or anything like that. So California had adopted one of those cottage food laws. But even then, it was remarkably invasive and burdensome. She had to schedule, an inspector to come to our home and look at, her whole setup. And, we didn't have 3 sinks. I mean, who has 3 sinks in their kitchen in a apartment? Nobody has that, And so she had to get these wash bins and label them, sanitize, wash, rinse, all this nonsense. It was actually really, really crazy. All the hoops that she had to jump through. She had to send the labels in and, make sure the labels had all of the right information on them. And, even with the cottage food law that made this technically legal, it was a complicated process. And you'll love this. Speaking of commercial space, we were in the Bay Area, and I remember her telling me when the inspector was there, he was saying, for a small home-based business, you can have up to, I think it was like $5,000 in gross revenue, not profit, but gross revenue. Once you hit that benchmark, you had to go and get commercial space. You could no longer operate out of your home. And his remark, he kind of turns to her and says, oh, but don't worry. By the time you're getting $5,000 in revenue, you'll have plenty of money to go rent commercial space. And I'm thinking, we're in the Bay Area. This is nuts. You are so out of touch with reality here. So it's crazy. And, the home-based business stuff, we have, I know in one of your articles, you mentioned the growth in sort of craft entrepreneurs, that sell their stuff on Etsy, and I think about, even podcasters or people who make money on Patreon or writing. I mean, those are very much, zero externality. They're just working in their homes doing something. And yeah, I mean, I think it's great for the economy and I want these businesses to grow. But at the same time, I mean, being able to work out of your home really opens up a lot of opportunity for people to do what they love and kind of dip a toe into it and see, is it for them? Do they have a base? Do people like what I'm doing? Can I make a living out of this? And being able to do that out of your home is so important for that first little step, or maybe trying something new. So I think this is an area that is ripe for reform. I hope we see a lot more home-based businesses of all kinds in the next few years, and so hopefully more cities will follow the example of Nashville. There has been a few states I know that have passed sort of preemption laws, right? So at the state level, they're basically saying, we're not going to allow our municipalities to basically outlaw this kind of entrepreneurship at the local level. What do you think of those laws, and do you think that those are going to pass in more places, or do you see most of the reforms happening here sort of city by city, block by block, or how do you see sort of tackling this issue of allowing more home-based businesses? How should we go about doing that?
So, generally, local governments in the United States are creatures of the state government. So I have no problem with states passing broad general laws that prevent local governments from having overly restrictive zoning laws. So that's one thing to say. Another thing to say is, that you're right. This is going to become a bigger issue as more people, often, for example, a husband and wife, they'll have young children. One of the parents wants to find a career path where they can stay at home. Especially with the high expense of daycare these days, they'll want a husband and wife to stay at home to during those early years of a child's growth. So then there's an increasing number of Americans dealing with home care for an aging parent. And, that's another big area, group of people that, they want to be able to find a profession in their home so they can care for a parent. So this is really an important issue. And I would, and your story about, your wife and her home-based business is an interesting one, because if you I know personally people, if government local zoning laws are too tight, regulations are too heavy, then businesses just simply go underground. People still start the home-based businesses, but they do it underground. So I mean, I know numerous businesses that are run by people I know. So one, for example, a friend of mine repairs things like lawnmowers and snowblowers and the like in their home, home appliances and the like. He doesn't create negative externalities for his neighbors. He creates positive externalities because the neighbors find that having a local handyman there, or who they trust to be able to bring their broken appliances and the like, they find it an extremely useful thing. But what he's doing is technically illegal, so he kind of has to do it sort of underground. And I know another, a woman who bakes products in her home here in Virginia. She sells the products on Facebook. What she's doing is technically illegal, I believe. But people love her. She's an expert. She has children, so she can't. She get to put in the expense of getting the commercial space and then working outside of the home is not really an option for her because she has young children. So she wants to be able to run this business out of her home and earn income for the family. So these issues are really important, and I think a lot of states and cities really need to look at deregulatory steps they can take.
Yeah. I mean, I just think why not give people the maximum amount of flexibility to figure out what kind of work arrangement is going to work for them? Like, I don't understand why that's so hard, I guess, is where I'm coming from. And and in the case of your friend who's the handyman, I would love to have a handyman who could around fix things. I mean, not only is that convenient, but there's also that level of accountability that you get when you know that person. It's not, I'm not sending it to some corporation that maybe they gave me a good product, but I don't know anybody there. They don't know me or anything like that. And so, yeah, I hope that we can kind of move in the right direction on that. So we'll definitely keep monitoring that. Well, I want to kind of start to wrap up here a little bit, and so I have a few sort of lightning round style questions for you. So feel free to pass or take as much time as you need to answer these questions. Some of them's a little pop quiz here for you, but I think they're kind of important issues. So one of the other terms that jumped out at me that you wrote about a little bit in your report was zombie firms. So can you explain what is a zombie firm and why should we be concerned about them?
Well, I got that phrase from there's a Morgan Stanley executive who had a Wall Street Journal op-ed a few months ago talking about zombie firms, which are firms that basically survive on borrowing and government subsidies and the like that aren't really efficient and should go by the wayside, but don't in our economy. And so it's one of the problems with government subsidies is they sometimes will keep businesses that are really inefficient and sucking up resources in the economy when really, for long-term economic growth, it's about new businesses and startups and growing firms, but they need to attract resources from the businesses that are antiquated and should go under. America, we have a profit and loss system. The loss-making firms should go under, and we ought to, reduce the barriers for the growing and expanding firms. That's the way you get economic growth in the economy.
Makes sense. So, if a state, let's say a state and state policymakers were looking to increase the number of new businesses in over, say, the next 3 to 5 years. What's maybe the most important or the one policy that you'd recommend that they adopt immediately before other things?
So you can think about small businesses in two ways. You can think about home-based businesses, which we were just discussing, Ben. We both agree that there's a heck of a lot, I think, that local governments can do to deregulate there, especially when you think about 2/3 of all startups start in homes. It's an incredibly important part of the economy. So that's one area. Then the other area on brick and mortar businesses, A lot of cities have these excessive permitting and licensing requirements for brick and mortar businesses. In cities like New York and San Francisco, it often can take a year to get all the dozens of licenses and permits and the like you need in line to open a restaurant. Some cities have these substantial corruption problems where it's really hard to get your restaurant or other local business, brick and mortar business opened unless you pay off someone, or you hire a lot of, in New York City, for example, and a lot of other cities, you often need to pay thousands of dollars to hire a professional expediter to get all your permits and licenses approved by the city bureaucracies. It's crazy. Often entrepreneurs you have to start renting, an expensive business location, paying thousands of dollars a month in rent, and you often have to wait a year before the city allows you to open. Well, how many people can afford that sort of those big upfront costs? All that local building and local zoning, permitting and licensing, it's an unneeded barrier. No one benefits but the bureaucracies from that. So cities need to speed up these approval processes. They need to make these approval processes a lot more transparent and speedy. There's no downside to that. All it needs is focus by mayors and city councils to make it much easier to open brick and mortar businesses in cities.
Looking ahead, what state is going to have the highest rate of new business formations in the year 2031?
That's an interesting question, Ben. I always, there is no doubt that the U.S. population, including the small business population, is moving south and west to states generally with lower taxes and less regulation. I've looked in detail at the interstate migration data, and there is no doubt that there's this constant drain of entrepreneurs and people and businesses from New York, for example, to Florida and Texas and Arizona and states like that. You would hope and think that states like New York would eventually, the policymakers would get it, the idea in their head that if you want to retain smart people and entrepreneurs and businesses, you need to make an inviting regulatory and tax environment for these businesses. I often will drive through New York State, and New York State is a beautiful place. It's a fantastic location for businesses. It's centrally located. They've got fantastic interstate access. You would think that New York State, outside of New York City, would thrive because of it's centrally located, but it doesn't because of bad policy, and it's really sad and unfortunate. So, looking ahead, I really would hope that states like New York and California, which is now also starting to lose substantial population to other states, you would hope that they would wise up and deregulate and reduce their tax burden. Sometimes people on the left will say, oh, well, people are only moving south because it's sunny and warmer in places like Texas and Florida. Well, of course that's true, but the message that I get from that is that states in the north, like Illinois, where it's cold and snowy, they have to work even harder to make an inviting climate for business. Those businesses in Chicago and Illinois are going to move south unless you make a more inviting climate for businesses to locate. And so I really hope that some of the northeastern and northern states sort of start to wake up to these new realities of mobility in the American economy.
Yeah, that's that's so true. I mean, I think sometimes, I hear that, like, oh, well, it's just because they're sunnier or they're warmer or something like that. I used to hear that a lot back when I was doing some other work that compared sort of the state economic climates. And, just thinking like, well, to your point, there's no legislation you can pass to have a less cold winter or something.
That's
like
right.
You've got to work with what you've got.
Right.
And
exactly. You policymakers can adjust the policy levers that they have, and they can't change the weather, so they've got to change these other policy levers to create a more inviting environment. That's right. Yeah.
So maybe you've already answered it. So if you have, you can refer back to that. But here's kind of my last question for you. If you somehow had the audience of every state lawmaker across the country, and you basically only had like 1 minute to tell them, one important thing about new business formation and sort of regulations. What's the one message that you'd want to get across to these state lawmakers?
I think that, startup businesses are hugely important. Small businesses create most net new jobs, and it's actually really the fast-growing small businesses that create a big bulk of jobs in America. So you've got to make your state more inviting for the future Amazons and Apples and Hewlett-Packards, all of which started as home-based businesses in people's garages. That's what you should be thinking about in terms of regulatory and tax policy. I think that think about regulations that raise costs on small businesses, like minimum wage laws. Think about regulations that unnecessarily get in the way of startups, like the permitting and licensing for brick and mortar businesses, and repeal these unnecessary zoning laws on home-based businesses. That's what I think you need to think about.
All right. Well, with that, we'll end it. Chris, thank you again for coming on and talking about the report, and hope to have you again on soon.
Thanks a lot for your interest, Ben. It was great.